This is John Reed for Canada's Anglo-Celtic Connections blog, and it's my pleasure to sit down with award-winning biographer, writer of historical creative non-fiction, and Order of Canada member, Charlotte Gray. We're at Carleton University, where she's an adjunct research professor and has just completed organising this year's series of Shannon Lectures. Her latest book, Midas, is the story of Harry Oakes, Sir Harry Oakes, from his birth in Maine, his many years prospecting for gold around the world, becoming one of the richest men in Canada when he discovered a rich vein of gold in Kirkland Lake. Most of the book is about his life as a multimillionaire and his murder in the Bahamas in 1943. Charlotte, Murdered Midas is your 11th book and the second that deals with crime. Much has previously been written about the Oakes murder, so what drew you to him and led you to present the story the way you did?
I thought the Oakes story had been so overdone in films and books that I would never actually write about it myself. Mm-hmm. But two things happened which persuaded me it would be a great subject. The first was that I realized that history, and I'm sorry to say, has got less and less popular appeal. Whenever you go into a bookstore these days, history is at the back of the store, and the books that are selling at the front of the store are about crime and murder. And so I have realized in the Massey murder that actually that's a way to pull readers in, and then you can actually sort of contextualize the crime with a lot of social history. Second thing that happened was that a friend said, Charlotte, you're very good at writing about poets and politicians, pioneers, but when are you going to do some serious history, business history? And I inwardly rolled my eyes because I thought that's not going to be very interesting. And then I realized that the Harry Oakes murder is the perfect subject because the murder, as you say in the introduction, in 1943 in the Bahamas was a huge story at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was a particularly brutal murder. He was a particularly rich man. It was in the middle of the war. The Duke of Windsor, former King Edward VIII, had been involved. There were all kinds of sort of juicy angles to it. And a wonderful trial. Everybody loves trials. Look what is shown on Netflix the whole time. But it's a bigger story, too. It's the story of the gold rush in Ontario in the early 20th century. I would be able to cover that and talk about how Toronto became the mining capital of the world. And at the same time, in the wrap-up chapters, I would also be able to touch on something else that interests me, how history gets written and how it can be distorted.
I have to say that the preliminary thing on how Northern Ontario developed was actually the part of the book that appealed to me most, because as like you, an immigrant, it was not something that I grew up with, and I'd sort of vaguely been aware that there was this mining boom there, but you really brought it to life for me.
Well, I've been amazed as I talked about the book to various people. We've all heard about the Klondike gold rush in the 1890s, and that's the sort of glamour gold rush for Canadian history. The Ontario gold rush, which began only about 20 years later, it, depending on what dates, what time frame you take, produced about 20 times as much gold as the Yukon did. Far more millionaires. And propped up the Ontario economy during the 1930s.
Yeah, that really impressed me.
Yeah.
As you know, most of my blog readers are family historians, and I asked them to suggest questions and was told they'd be interested in your background.
My background?
So I looked a little bit into it. You were born in Sheffield.
Correct.
In Yorkshire. Little genealogy research says your father was John Gray.
Wrong.
My
father was Robert Gray.
Robert Gray. Well, I got hold of the wrong one then. Your mother was a Kathleen?
No, my mother was Elizabeth.
Oh, okay. So my genealogy skills are obviously lacking. So I guess the question was, what were the influences in your childhood that have led you to the career you now have? What did you want to be when you grew up?
I think I always wanted to be a writer. I came from a very conventional family in Sheffield. My father was a lawyer, and I came, in fact, though, from a family that had a long sense of its own history. Sheffield was Steel City in the 19th century, one of the very prosperous cities in the north of England that were key to Britain's industrial success. When I was growing up in Sheffield, as part of a huge sort of extended network of steel and cutlery families who'd been there for some time, I had a strong sense of my own family history and a strong sense of the importance of the Industrial Revolution. And I think combined with that was I had great teachers, both in my public school and then in the boarding school I went to. I had really inspirational teachers. And I was studying history at a time when it was still seen as a narrative and literary subject rather than a analytical social science. So because I loved reading, because I loved the past, history was always sort of somewhere I felt very comfortable.
So there were lots of books in your home when you were growing up?
I wouldn't say an overabundance of books. I always read voraciously, and my brother and sister did too. But we went to the library. We were big library users. And then, of course, we went to very academic schools, which encouraged the same pursuit.
Did you live far from the library?
When I was growing up in Sheffield, it was on the way back from school.
So it was very close.
It was close, yes.
Yeah, which always helps.
It does.
When you've got a nearby library. Well, you went to Oxford.
I did.
You did a BA in modern history.
Correct. And I mean, I just want to say modern history by Oxford standards is not what most people realise as modern. I mean, it was supposed to be, the curriculum over 3 years was 1066 to 1939. Nobody ever got much beyond 1870.
Yes.
We never reached 90. We never got to the 20th century.
We never did World War I, and when I was doing history at school in England. Anyway, then you did a diploma in social administration at the London School of Economics.
Yes, at that stage I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. A friend was filling in the forms to do a diploma in social administration, and I said, well, that sounds fun, and I want to live in London, so I just copied her.
Now, there's a bit of a gap in the story, your story, that I could find in the 1970s, and maybe we can talk a little bit later about how you go in and fill in a gap when you're researching someone and you can't find much information. But I did a little bit of search, and I did find something from you from 1977. I don't know if this rings a bell.
Wow. This is an article, it's one in a series I did originally I had a column in the Evening Standard in London, which I had never realised had been also republished in the Newcastle Evening Chronicle. I had a column called Living Alone in London. I think if I read it now, I would absolutely blush. It's all about me,
yes.
Which I think, every newspaper tends to have a perky column by a young woman. And in the late 1970s in London, that was me. But, I mean, now I'd look at it and think, I don't think you're nearly as interesting as you think you are.
So were you a writer from the time you finished at LSE?
I did several things. I spent my 20s doing what I realize in retrospect was an enormously privileged thing to be able to do. I tried out several careers. I was a teacher for 1 year, realized that anything must be easier than teaching. I have such respect for teachers. Yeah. I then went and worked in the British Foreign Office. There's a figure there called the historical advisor to the Foreign Secretary. And I was his research assistant, which was fascinating. We were going through the documents about the Potsdam Agreement, preparatory to them being published in a volume of Foreign Office correspondence. Then I went and worked on the Daily Express, and then I edited a magazine, Psychology Today. So I tried various careers and realized that I hated teaching, loved writing.
You came to Canada in the late 1970s.
I came to Canada because at Oxford, I'd met a Canadian,
Right.
and we'd stayed in touch. And I came to stay with him, and he absolutely promised me that if we got married, we'd only be in Canada for another couple of years. And I believed him.
But you started writing as soon as you came. I found this one from 1978.
I'm very impressed by your research, John. This one, A Day in the Life of Keith Davey, the backroom strategist for the Liberal Party. When I came to Canada, had already, as I mentioned, had quite a lot of experience of writing. And my husband said, oh, well, just come and live in Ottawa for a year, and it's the capital of the country. There'll be lots of magazines and papers published there, and you'll soon find work with your experience. And I arrived and, of course, discovered that books and magazines were actually published in Toronto, not in Ottawa. But I had an enormous advantage over somebody who moved to Toronto, which was that I went and talked to all the Toronto editors, and they weren't particularly interested in me until I said I lived in Ottawa. At that stage, there was much, much more interest in federal politics and in what was going on in Ottawa. It was a much more glamorous place. Still the Trudeau era,
Yes.
the first Trudeau era. And so when they heard I was in Ottawa, they started commissioning pieces from me about federal politics. Did I know anything about federal politics? Zip, zilch, nothing. But, one of the things about being a good journalist is that you immerse yourself in the subject and you talk to everybody. You educate yourself as fast as possible. I very quickly did get some really interesting commissions and began to learn about Canada and began to learn that, in fact, Ottawa was a fabulous place to learn about Canada because you could meet people from all over the country. I was speaking to cabinet ministers from Newfoundland to British Columbia. I was talking to sort of advocates of different causes. I got it. It was a bit like sort of being in a in a railway station that everybody has to travel through.
A couple of questions on the craft of writing, because you just mentioned that you get consumed by the material that's surrounding you, particularly here in Ottawa, and I guess that's why you're not just here for 2 years. You stayed, but in a talk for the Walrus, you spoke about developing a feeling for the sound of Alexander Graham Bell. I guess the inventor of the telephone, the sound is important. What aspects of Oak's life did you need to get a feel for, and how do you go about doing that?
Oakes was a much more impenetrable character than Alexander Graham Bell. Bell had left a lot of correspondence, as well as his laboratory notes, private correspondence to members of his family. And so I was able to hear his voice, able to sort of see how his mind worked through those handwritten letters. They were a joy to work with. I had nothing like that from Oakes. I barely had a signature. This was not a reflective man, not a man who, as far as I know, wrote love letters to anybody. So for the Oakes research, the only way I could get into his space, really, was seeing where he came from, where he lived, reading oral histories from people who had known him, reading newspaper clips of interviews with him, and generally sort of trying to think about a man who was obsessive from childhood about making a fortune and determined he could do it by finding gold. And then a man who had really lost interest in mining as soon as he'd made his fortune. In fact, since I published the book, I've heard other stories about this strange and in many ways not particularly likable man. And some of the stories have sort of emphasized how crude he could be or how abrupt. I'm beginning to actually think that, now we might even say he's on the spectrum, or, because he had no small talk. He was impulsive. He was he could be just so abrupt to deal with. There's sort of elements of Asperger's about him, but I found that the only way I could really gauge what he was like with his relationships were his relationships with others. And some of them, such as his relationship with his wife, were obviously very good.
Yes.
Others, his relationships with people who he thought were trying to screw him, were awful.
Another aspect of working the craft of writing, because family historians struggle with how to write about periods of a person's life when basically the information is not there, it's blank. And I mean, you mentioned having a problem with Oak's documentary evidence, and particularly his life as a prospector before he came to Ontario. I think you actually mentioned this in the book. How do you deal with the lack of evidence but avoid straying into fiction?
Well, I never make things up, even though, I'm shocked at the number of times my non-fiction books, not just mine, are described as novels. I don't know that people always understand there's a difference between fiction and non-fiction.
Yes.
In terms of the challenge of family histories, and particularly where there are gaps, all you can do is be brutally honest. We have no evidence. Mm-hmm. Then you can go to secondary sources. Yes. This is what was happening at the time. And the third way you can sometimes deal with this is looking at photographs and using photographs to sort of not exactly fill the gaps, but to say what he looked like at the time. Sort of, you can infer some personality from photos, how he chooses to stand, how he chooses to relate to other people within the photograph. For me, frankly, the fact that I only had the sort of wisps of knowledge of where Oakes was in the 15 years that it's not exactly clear. I knew he'd been in New Zealand, Australia, South America, Arizona, and there were one or two anecdotes. In some ways it didn't matter, because the other thing about writing a book, a biography, is that not every year is as interesting as every other year. So it's fine if you telescope 15 years into 3 paragraphs of saying, I don't really know what happened. I do know this is what he was doing. But since he was a complete failure during those 15 years, let's fast forward to when life picks up.
Finally, Charlotte, you've been a judge on numerous award panels so you've read a lot of books. I was wondering if there's a book you've read and perhaps reread that you wish you'd written. And what is it about it that appeals to you?
Thinking about biographies, one of the books that's been published recently that I most admire is a book that, in fact, we had the author as one of the Shannon lectures, that you mentioned in your introduction, and that's Maya Jasanoff's book about Joseph Conrad, the book's called Dawn Watch, and it takes a very dead, extraordinary novelist, Joseph Conrad, and presents him in terms sort of not of his literary value, which is the way that he's always been presented before, but in terms of the world in which he operated and the world he knew. She presents him as a global citizen. And her writing is a delight. So that's one book I would really have read twice.
I've read The Murdered Midas, a millionaire, his gold mine, and a strange death on an island paradise from cover to cover. It certainly kept my interest, and I'm sure it would make a welcome Christmas gift for any Canadian interested in our history. So I commend it, and I commend you for writing it. And John, thank you very much for taking the time.
Well, thank you for this interview and for the Christmas recommendation.